Okay, very good. All right, we're right on 3:30. I'll wait an extra couple of seconds, but we'll get underway quickly because we have a bumper edition today. All right. Excellent. It's a crazy job admitting everybody, Roshni. All right, welcome everybody. This is a bumper edition of HEI webinar, and we've got people queuing up to get in the door here, so that's fantastic. We've got over 30 people at the moment, and still they keep coming, so that's great. My name is Michael Olf, and I've been associated with the committee for some time now. I'll be the sort of host tonight. We've got 5 speakers tonight, all talking about energy and renewables and so on, as per the promotional material you would have seen. So we've got Paul Graham, who's the Chief Economist for Energy at CSIRO. Adam Clarke is the Sustainability Manager at the City of Newcastle. Amer Hussein is the Head of the Liddell Transition at HEI Energy. And then Jenny Hayward is Senior Research Scientist in CSIRO's Energy and Hydrogen Economics. Oh, sorry. Senior Research Scientist in CSIRO Energy and Hydrogen Economics Specialist. And Sam Mella brings up the rear. She's the Hunter Engagement Lead for Beyond Zero Emissions. So looking forward to all of those talks. Look, before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Awabakal people. I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people involved today and on wherever you are today as well, because you know, there could be people from all over the place. And I think in our last meeting we had about 3 or 4 different states represented, so that was great. Okay, so let me just find my pieces of paper. They're all virtual. So what we'll do is we'll start off with Paul, then Adam, then Amer, and Amer has to leave, so we'll give him a few minutes of Q&A after his talk, and then we'll go to Jenny, then Sam, and then we'll go to a general Q&A. You can put questions into the chat as we go if you like, and that will enable you to sort of get them queued up so that we're ready to go, kind of thing. We can then go to those questions, you know, when the time is right. You can raise your hand if you wish, but we'll try and get through the presentations as much as we can on time, and you know, try and keep us there so we're not having a lot of overlap at the end of the discussions. All right, so look, firstly, I'd just like to now welcome and introduce Paul Graham. Paul's our first speaker, and Paul is the Chief Economist for Energy at CSIRO. He's responsible for advice on the economic drivers and outcomes for the energy sector and leading projects of national significance in partnership with industry and government. Paul's been with the CSIRO for 20 years and is also a member of the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, which assesses abatement methods for the Emissions Reduction Fund. Paul, if you like to take yourself off mute, I'll hand over the reins to you for 20 minutes. We'll go from now till about 3:55 or 5 to 4. Thanks very much, Paul.
Great. Hi, everyone. Let me just put full screen that. Okay. So I want to talk to you about projections for distributed energy, which is, in this case, I'm going to focus on rooftop solar, batteries, and electric vehicles. And I want to talk a little bit about how much of that type of technology we'll expect to see over time, and then what impact we think that'll have. And when we're doing forecasting for this type of technology, because it's mostly purchased by households and businesses, we use an approach which tries to take into account not just financial drivers, but non-financial drivers. So you'll see on the right there, we've got a sort of a structural long-term model where we look at essentially a consumer technology adoption curve approach, where we think about, early adopters, mainstream adopters and late adopters, and we put people into categories and try to figure out how their demographics, their infrastructure constraints, and all those sorts of non-financial drivers affect how big the market share can be in a particular zone within Australia. So we do this modelling down at a sort of a SA2 or postcode level. And we also look at financial drivers, which are what's happening to the cost of these technologies over time relative to the electricity price or relative to a standard vehicle and so forth. So if you like, the demographic and structural constraints set how high the adoption can go, and the financial things sort of set how quickly you can move along the adoption curve. But that's more of a long-term approach. In the short-term approach, we just use trend analysis, and the trend analysis is useful just to sort of do a good short-term forecast. And one of the things that we've had to deal with in forecasting more recently is the impact of COVID-19. So we've had to sort of try and understand how quickly we think the economy will recover and those sorts of impacts. So we sort of put all those sort of three different drivers together to do our forecasts, sort of immediate economic drivers, past trends, and structural changes in the way customers perceive the technology. And just coming back to recent trends, we've had a fairly flat year recently for battery uptake. In 2019, there were about 20,000 installations, according to Sudwin's, who published that data, and 20,000 was also the amount that we had of batteries we had installed in 2018, so there was no increase in battery sales. For electric vehicles, we had a big year in 2019. It was a big jump relative to 2018. But 2018 was a bit of a low year, so it's a high trend, but coming off a lower base in 2018. And for rooftop solar, Clean Energy Regulator publishes that data. 2019 was a very, very strong year, one of the strongest years we've had in probably 7 or 8 years. And it's interesting that the first quarter of 2020, even though people were already in lockdown and so forth associated with COVID, there wasn't any slowing down in the first quarter of 2020, but we're just starting to see in the second quarter some impacts of COVID. So I guess people are feeling the pinch in terms of maybe they've lost their job or they're a bit uncertain about the future of the economy. And the scenarios that we work with when we're doing the projections are the scenarios that Australian Energy Market Operator have set up for their integrated system planning. So they've got two axes they're looking at: decentralisation or essentially distributed energy, or decarbonisation. So high DER has a lot of distributed energy. Step change has a lot of decarbonisation and distributed energy. So there's a sort of a spectrum there, with the central scenario being the middle case, if you like, and slow change being the least change of all the scenarios. So here's the sort of projections that we produce for those scenarios. And the dotted line projections are the projections we did in 2019. And the solid lines are the projections for those ISP scenarios which we did in 2020. And you'll see that sort of around this period here, this is where we're sort of saying there's going to be COVID impacts. So we've kind of reduced some of the projections there. But overall, we're probably thinking rooftop solar will be higher than we did in 2019 in the long term. That's partly because we've updated some cost data, but it also represents the stronger growth that we've been able to see, where we've moved further along the adoption curve than we expected, and in 2019. So the range there is, we're around 10 10 gigawatts now, and we're sort of moving towards sort of 25 to almost 70 gigawatts in the long run. So it's a huge amount of capacity to deal with. For batteries, we're looking at an unusual trend because the costs we've got, and you see the costs on the right there, the costs are projected, these are an input assumption, and they're projected to sort of fall fairly rapidly to 2030 and then flatten out. So that's why we've got the shape you can see here, and a lot of these projections have got stronger growth to 2030 that then sort of flattens out. It's because those costs have flattened out the adoption, the movement along the adoption curve. But generally speaking, some of these projections we did in 2019 look like they were too optimistic. And so we pulled those back a bit, but longer term, we're kind of in sort of a similar area. The reason some of these were more sort of optimistic in 2019 is because it looked like, and this was sort of, those projections were done before the last election, it looked like some governments might have put in more subsidies and support for batteries, but that hasn't really eventuated. There's only really subsidies in South Australia at the moment, and a little bit in Victoria and the ACT, but there isn't kind of, unlike solar, there isn't a broad-based subsidy scheme for batteries in Australia, so their payback period is quite a bit higher, and they're not moving as fast as other technologies. So when we put together the battery and the rooftop solar projections, you can sort of get a sense for, you know, percentage of people who have both systems, so the percentage of people who have both rooftop solar and batteries. We expect that to rise over time because the battery uptake, although it's low, is rising from a lower base and rising faster than the rooftop solar. And generally speaking, we don't predict as much battery ownership in the commercial sector as we do in the residential sector, and that's partly because commercial customers, when they use solar, it actually aligns a lot better with their load. So they don't have to necessarily use a battery to kind of realign the solar with their load, whereas residential customers quite often have to do that because they're not using as much power during the day as what they're generating. So I'm just going to move on to electric vehicles. When we think about electric vehicles, one of the big things that we're kind of working against if we want to get to really high shares of electric vehicles in Australia is that it takes sort of 25 to 30 years for a vehicle to move out of the stock in Australia. So if you want to complete, for example, this step change scenario, when there were some discussions with stakeholders, they sort of said, well, step change is meant to be the scenario where we get to maybe a 1.5 to 2 degree world. So this is a major abatement scenario. So we should try and decarbonise the whole road transport sector if we can. And yeah, the problem with getting there is just whether you can push out enough vehicles, internal combustion vehicles, fast enough. You sort of need to get to 100% sales as fast as you can. But it has to remain plausible because we're at, you know, extremely low percentage sales right now. So there was a lot of, you know, work to get that scenario to work. And in the end, we didn't think we could push sales any quicker than what we had. So we did some accelerated scrapping of internal combustion vehicles to get to the full 100% fleet share that we wanted to achieve by 2050 in that scenario. So that's the grey line if you're not sure. That could require some extra government assistance to get that result, or there could be a collapse in internal combustion vehicle servicing at some point. So once they become a small part of the, once they become, you know, less than 20% of the fleet, it's not clear that there would be the same services available to internal combustion vehicles. There might not be as many petrol stations, there might not be as many mechanics they can go to. So it could be that the market sort of accelerates at the end there anyway, just because of other drivers. Trucks are, of course, difficult to electrify, not impossible, and we're seeing a lot of electric trucks in the market as prototypes, but we did decide that we would allocate only 50% of trucks to electric driven and 50% were fuel cell trucks. So it's not a complete electrification, but it's very close. And maybe that hydrogen comes from electricity anyway. So when you look at the numbers, so this covers the whole fleet in about 22 million vehicles in the long run. Some of that includes the fact that we might get some autonomous vehicles and other changes to the fleet, so that we won't need as big a fleet as we tend to now per person. So the numbers are somewhere between 5 and 22 million electric vehicles in the long run. And that when those vehicles are running and we know how many kilometres a year they do and we know the efficiency of the electric vehicles, we can work out just how much electricity we're talking about. So it's somewhere between about 22 and 110 terawatt hours in the long run. But you can see this is more of an extreme scenario than the others. The others are more in that sort of 22 to 50 terawatt hour range. And one of the questions about that electricity consumption is when does it happen during the day? And these are some profiles for charging. We took this profile here, which is we're calling the convenience profile in blue, from a study which had about 1,000 vehicles in it. So it's an after diversity. We could see that if we get a lot of vehicles charging just when they want to charge, let's say they're on a flat tariff, so it doesn't really matter when they charge up, they'll mostly choose, there'll be some charging during the day, but they'll mostly choose to charge and plug in when they get home from whatever their daily activities are. So that's when you get this kind of charging peak at night. We also found that charge sizes are getting bigger. So when people did electric vehicle studies 5 or 10 years ago, they were mainly looking at sort of 3 kilowatt charges. But a lot of the charges that companies selling electric vehicles are sort of putting people towards are more sort of 7 to 10 kilowatts. So this shape is a bit sharper than it may be, just reflecting the current trend in charges, if you like. These other profiles, so there's one here, this green one is sort of our fast charge highway profile, and that kind of represents people who are not charging at home but charging off fast charging stations. And what we've found in countries where they have a lot of electric vehicles is that the shape of that charging profile as a population of vehicles tends to reflect the more the traffic. So when the traffic's on the system, so traffic comes on the system and then fades into the night. And then the other charging profiles we've got here is a day charging profile, where we've said, what if we could move people into charging during the day to align with solar? And then this is a charging profile, what if we sort of made people charge in the night? And you might do that with, for example, some sort of time of use tariff or other incentive scheme. So that's a lot of different charging profiles with a lot of different implications. And I just wanted to go through how that looks. So as I said, we've got electric vehicle demand potentially coming onto the Australian electricity system, which is generally a system running at about 200 terawatt hours. We're going to add anywhere between 25 and 110 terawatt hours by 2050. And when we look at the load, this is a typical load in 2030, where the load is hollowed out during the day because of people operating their rooftop solar systems. And once the solar stops producing, the average load ramps up and you get a bit of a peak at night. And you can see that coincides fairly well with that peak with this convenience charging profile. So if there's no change to tariffs and there's no incentives for people to shift the way they charge their electric vehicles, then we'll just add to this evening peak. But the option is, can we get charging to go into this part of the day? This seems like this would be the best place. If we could fill this gap here created by rooftop solar, then let's get people to charge during the day. Charging at night is probably not as useful as it used to be. We'd get everyone to run their hot water systems at night, but because we have this big problem with solar during the day now, hollowing out the daytime load, we probably want to put people in here for charging their electric vehicles. But that implies that wherever people park their vehicle during the day, that we can actually set up some sort of charging at the place where people park. So technically it's easy to design a tariff and it's easy to design incentives for people to do this, but can they actually, when their vehicle is parked during the day, can they actually charge at that place where they're parking? So this becomes an infrastructure question more than a technical tariff question. But there is one problem with setting up the tariff, is that if you just set it up for the whole year and just say, encourage everyone to charge during the day, unfortunately you'll get a few days where there actually is really poor solar output. So this load, which was down here, will actually jump up to here because people's solar systems are not producing. And then if we add electric vehicles on top of that, we'll end up creating a new peak, which is electric vehicles charging during the day and not being offset by rooftop solar. So I guess ideally, if we're going to set up this daytime charging process, we probably want it to be a little bit dynamic, so that if we see we've got a day where rooftop solar is going to be really low, we probably don't want everyone to completely charge during the day. They can leave some charging to later on into the night, so that we don't create a new peak which is potentially even higher than the old peak. And just to talk a little bit about this highway fast charging one, this actually looks pretty good in the sense that people charging randomly during the day, during periods when they're on the road, is probably pretty well aligned with solar anyway, and is probably not going to impact the peak too much. So highway fast charging looks good, but this profile is kind of based on a particular set of circumstances, and it could get out of shape a little bit. It sort of depends on what are the number of charges at each station, what's the power rating of those charges. So you might get this profile, but maybe some big spikes if the charges are really high. Or you might drag the profile out to the sides if there's queuing. So it does depend a little bit about how those fast chargers are set up. So we'll have to wait and see whether this is the profile that we'll see in Australia, because this is from overseas experience at this point in time. Okay, I'll finish there.
That's great, Paul. Thank you very much for that. For those of you that have just joined in the last 10 minutes or so, we're up to 61 people now, which is great. We've got 1 minute for questions before we move to the next speaker, but I'll just ask one, Paul. Well, an observation, I guess. When we get to things like school holidays and everyone's out on the highway, I can see some big peaks happening there. But can I ask you, what do you think is missing in terms of helping to accelerate the uptake of EVs at the moment in Australia?
Look, I think there's a lot of unmet demand for electric vehicles for people who are waiting for the price to come down. The vehicle itself, looks like it'll meet most people's needs, although I'll be able to find a version of an electric vehicle when the number of models improves. we get a very narrow range of electric vehicles in Australia, but the models that are available overseas are wide enough that I think people will be able to find, you know, the electric vehicle ute that they want and the electric vehicle, you know, station wagon or four-wheel drive or run around or whatever they want. So if people can get the model that they want, the question then is really cost. And we don't have any really program to assist with the costs. And it may take either us waiting for other countries to bring down the costs or some sort of government subsidy in the short term to get those sales moving. Because at the moment, it's really just people buying the vehicle and not worrying about the payback period. People who are price insensitive are actually leading the market at the moment. But we need the mainstream market to take over when costs are a bit lower.
Yes, indeed. All right, thanks for that. We're at 3:55 now. We've got to push through to our next speaker. Thank you, Paul. If you wouldn't mind hanging on till the end, there'll be a Q&A session at the end for any further questions. So now I'd like to introduce to you Adam Clarke, and Adam is a sustainability manager at the City of Newcastle. And Adam, I did see you driving an electric vehicle just a week or so ago. Since 2012, Adam has been managing and analysing energy and resources across council operations. He has played a critical role in managing council's shift to 100% renewable electricity supply and development and delivery of their 5-megawatt solar farm. He's also involved in innovative projects such as the expansion of their fibre and Wi-Fi network, street lighting upgrades, rooftop solar and battery storage, electric vehicle transition and charging, energy efficiency and demand response. Further details can be found here. There you go, I just read that bit. Can you believe that? Okay, so there's more information there. So you can go to the website and check out Adam and find out more information. Adam, I think you deserve a cape and a badge and a fantastic, you know, I don't know, a lot of recognition for what you've been doing with the City of Newcastle. I look forward to your presentation, mate. Take it away.
Thanks, Michael. Okay. Okay, hi everyone. I've noticed a few familiar faces, so apologies for the repetition on some of these slides. I've also got far too many of them, so I'll try and get through them. So today, talking a little bit about our off-site renewables, also our renewable PPA and the draft climate action plan, which is currently out on public exhibition. So last couple of years, or since 2012, we've been delivering actions in the Carbon and Water Management Action Plan, which has got an end date of 2020. It covers, you know, a range of areas: energy, water, waste, and liquid fuels, and also had some sort of key targets around electricity reduction and also increasing our use of renewables within our council operations. So when we started delivering some of the actions out of here, we obviously looked at our emissions profile and found that electricity and street lighting, so electricity for street lighting, accounted for roughly 80% of our council emissions. So it's been a real key focus area over the last few years. So we've been focusing on quite a lot of energy efficiency projects, building upgrades, upgrading the street lighting, but also figuring out how we can really ramp up, basically from a standing start, our renewable energy generation. So back in 2012, we began the first rollout of our rooftop solar, completed a number of other systems as we go, and we continue to roll out solar and battery storage across our sites. But at the same time, we realised that we needed to look at something a bit bigger if we were going to reach some of the targets that we'd set. So last few years, we also started looking at an off-site solar farm out at Summer Hill. It's sitting on a landfill, closed landfill site out there. Has a lot of great attributes in terms of it, you know, really close to a substation out there, operational site, you know, impaired land that you can't do much with. So it was ticking a lot of boxes there. Obviously had some engineering challenges to overcome, but, you know, happy to say that we've now built that out at Summer Hill. and it's going to provide quite a lot of other opportunities going forward as we also start to look at converting our waste fleet over to electric and looking at some of the other operations that we might be able to undertake out at Summerhill there. So as I mentioned, operational since November 2019. We've been tracking it pretty closely, and happy to say that it's going pretty well so far, against all the sort of performance models and metrics that we'd been looking at. Between that and our rooftop solar, that was going to get us to about 50-60% renewable energy share. So we're already kind of exceeding our 30% target for 2020. Bearing in mind that was set back in 2011 and 12 when renewables were about 4 times the price. So we sort of upped our ambition as that price drop really came through and made it economical. So sort of earlier last year in April, we also had council, off the back of the success of these other projects that we delivered, asked us to look at a business case for how could we get to 100% renewables. What's the sort of time frame? Could it be 2020? Would it be 2025, 2030? So we went away and did some quite detailed modelling and business cases and looked at all the different options to get to that 100% renewables, and came up with a variety of solutions that we went back to council for approval for. But it also really well aligned with our existing energy strategy, that was getting all our contracts to basically come up for renewal around about the same time. It started January 2020. So it gave us this great opportunity to put everything out to market, see what the options were, and move forward on targeting 100%. In terms of our sort of daily consumption profile, the orange and the blue there is our sort of small and large sites, so a lot of daytime usage. Fits quite well with the solar shape, but we also have this grey sort of evening load from our street lighting. So as we started to look at some of the options and solutions for getting that extra renewable energy purchase, we wanted pretty much an inverse solar load. So we could either do it with battery storage, which, as Paul previously has spoken about, is still quite expensive in that space. Or starting to look at some other renewable generators that had a better matching load profile to that. One that we were aware of that we knew we could potentially get sign a supply agreement with was a wind farm, and this is sort of that modelling of what its monthly output is at that wind farm, and it really kind of had a great load shape there to meet our evening street lighting load, and also cover off some of the daytime energy use as well. So on the back of all that, we went to tender about September last year, sort of signing an agreement in November, and then as of 1 January this year, we switched over to that 100% renewable electricity contract. Proud to say we're the first council in New South Wales to do that, and one of a handful of councils across Australia, but really starting to see quite a lot of momentum in this space, and particularly off the back of a lot of work that's already been done. Quite a lot of councils are moving in this space, which is great to see. So quite a bit of a sort of technical setup, which I'll do my best to explain briefly, but effectively we went out to market with our large sites and signed a energy supply agreement. Hopefully you can see my mouse pointer there, but over on the left. So instead of our sort of normal fixed electricity contracts, we moved our sites over to the spot market. So we kind of get the prevailing half-hour spot price, plus the sort of retail trade fee. It, you know, can be create some risk in some areas, but all the modelling sort of showed that by moving over to that, you know, we're really going to take advantage of some of those lower wholesale prices, and with a bit of demand response in future, we can actually get even further savings and further opportunity by being able to reduce our load during some of those high price events. Sitting alongside that, we also have the virtual generation agreement, or the Renewable PPA, power purchase agreement. So this was signed with Sapphire Wind Farm, which was actually developed by CWP, which has a sort of headquarters here in Newcastle, which is great. I believe the turbines also came through Port of Newcastle, so a great sort of regional story there. So we buy effectively the same amount of electricity we use each year from this wind farm. It's getting sold into the spot market at the same time that we're purchasing from the spot market. So when it's generating and we're using that same amount, we're paying that rate that we've agreed. And when, you know, outside those times, we're either exposed to the spot market or we're selling that excess wind generation to the market. So quite a bit of sort of modelling and thinking behind that about what the outcome would be there. And then finally, a sort of another agreement off to the side of that was the energy generation agreement. So that was our solar farm, you know, separately selling into the wholesale spot as well, and taking that revenue. So again, it's a complex area, but this is just an example of a particularly volatile day back in January, where we saw some really rapid price spikes during the day, particularly in that afternoon period, where the price went up to $14,500 a megawatt hour. So if we look at sort of number one here, in the orange area is the load that we're using during that day. The purple with the black line is kind of is the wind generation. So when we're using below that line, we're matching with that wind farm and we're paying that spot rate. When our consumption's above that, we're exposed to the spot, but that's the sort of early hours of the morning, so not a big price there. What happens in that afternoon when we've got that big price spike is we're actually generating a lot from our solar farm, which is sitting off separately. So we've got the wind farm hedge, but we also have the solar farm as an additional hedge, which we'll utilise more on site in future with electric garbage trucks and things like that. And then as we ramp up into the evening, the wind picks up again and covers our sort of load in that evening peak as well. So when we start to look at how that's gone over the last 6 to 7 months since we've been underway, this graph in the top left there is tracking our performances against business as usual. After a bit of a sort of shaky start in that January period with the bushfires, we've kind of recovered to the end of February, and we're now kind of well ahead of where we were if we had been on a standard contract. This graph below that is showing the coverage throughout this 7-month period from the wind farm. So it's actually producing enough to cover all our site load, except for a little bit of an afternoon or evening exposure there in the orange. And that's something we'll look to address with battery storage going forward and some demand response. And then at the same time, we've got, you know, our solar revenue sitting alongside that, which has had some great days where the price was really big, but has also been quite steady over that period. So just conscious of time a bit, but yeah, so that's sort of our offsite energy, renewable energy strategy and our PPA over delivery of this existing carbon and water management plan. As I mentioned, we've done quite a lot of energy efficiency projects, a lot of rooftop solar and storage. As we've started to deal with electricity as an emission source, we're now looking closely at transport as well. So we've started converting over some of our fleet to electric, so our passenger fleet, and also looking at our trucks in parks and depot operations and things like that. And at the same time, also doing a feasibility study for converting our electric garbage truck over to electric as well. Some of the numbers in terms of those targets that we'd set, we had quite a range of targets and quite ambitious things, but we did pretty well in terms of electricity reduction, about a 17% reduction over that period, about 14% in water reduction, 7% in fuel use. Well and truly achieved that 30% renewable electricity target by getting to 100%. And overall, because of the big impact that electricity had in terms of our carbon emissions, we saw about a 77% reduction overall, excluding what we take at the landfill, which is beyond our sort of own council operations. So diving in a bit to the draft climate action plan, which is currently on exhibition until the 31st of August. It's a plan that sits under our Newcastle 2030 CSP, or Community Strategic Plan. Below that, we have our other strategies, like our Newcastle Environmental Strategy, which is currently under review. So this is an action plan that sits under that strategy and links in and supports some of the other areas like waste management, urban forestry and things like that, as well as some of the other strategies like our cycling strategy, where a lot of work is going into that area at the moment as well. It's clearly focused on mitigation in terms of reducing our carbon emissions as opposed to adaptation. So that's another sort of whole area that we need to consider in terms of what do we do with urban heat island and more extreme heat days. What are we going to do about rising sea level and the likes? So this plan isn't focused on those areas. It's focused on what we can do to reduce emissions, not just in our own operations, but right across the city as well. In terms of the development timeframe, we've had quite a bit of early engagement. Went to council last month for approval to go on to public exhibition. So we're in that exhibition period out to 31 August, and encourage anyone that's interested to go onto our website, have a look through the plan, and hopefully provide some feedback before that consultation process finishes. Based on all that, we'll take that back and develop the final plan to hopefully get adopted by the end of this year, so we can kick off straight away in 2021 and start delivering some of the actions out of it. It aligns, quite well with the state government plan. They've got their stage 1 net zero plan as well. So how do we, encourage existing take up of technologies that are already well proven? How do we help businesses and residents make more sustainable choices? How do we invest in new technologies? And also, how do we lead by example? So those key priorities that the state government have are well aligned with what we're looking to do ourselves. Also, did quite a lot of work in terms of integrating the sustainable development goals, and that was based on some of the community feedback about what they wanted us to focus on. So beyond these sort of high level 17 goals, there's about 247 targets that sit under that. So we've mapped this new action plan to about 30 of those targets that sit under those lower levels. I really do have too many slides. So in terms of where we got to, we removed electricity as an emission source by getting to 100% renewables. We now have transport fuels as our next big target on the hit list. It accounts for about 90%, and we use about 1.6 million litres of fuel per year. And that's pretty evenly split against our different vehicle and fleet type. that's just sort of a pathway to get us to net zero by 2030. Blue and the purple have been dealt with through electricity emissions. So now that orange area is a big focus over the next 5 years. Some of the initial targets we've proposed is continuing that electricity reduction. We want a balancing impact where at the same time as we're reducing electricity use, if we're converting our fleet to electric, we're going to see some increase. So we want to make sure that that's kept in balance. Continuing to upgrade our street lighting and other lighting to LED, that big target on fuel reduction, and also continuing that carbon emission reduction. For our corporate emissions, there's 4 key themes that they sit under. So 100% renewable energy supply, not just electricity, but all forms of energy, such as gas and fuel use. Best practice in energy, water and waste across our facilities. Starting to really work with our suppliers on how can we reduce those supply chain emissions, and supporting that zero emission transport future. So a number of actions that sit under each of those themes, and as I mentioned, we've also mapped the sort of SDGs across those and have an objective on each of these. You know, looking at establishing organics processing, which we're doing, but then also how do we reuse a lot more materials and recycle materials in our business. Encourage that sustainable supply chain and create a closed loop on a lot of what we do, and starting to transition all our light fleet, our heavy trucks and also our garbage trucks over to electric as well. I think I mentioned earlier 2 parts to the plan. One's our operations, and then also equally important, how do we work with the community? I can see that clock ticking down, Michael. I'm nearly finished. So again, looking at the city emissions, and thanks to BZE and Ironbark for that snapshot. Electricity is about 2/3, and transport's about 1/4. So they're big focus areas for us as well. 4 key themes again in this area: low emissions development, encouraging clean technology, supporting electric transport, and also supporting the new zero emission industries that I'm sure we'll hear a lot more from BZE on that million jobs plan as well. So actions that sit under that, again, I encourage you to go and take a closer look and hopefully provide some feedback, so that we can get this document right, and get working on Net Zero Newcastle. Website's there. I'm sure we might share the slides or something after this event, but otherwise get in touch and I can point you in the right direction. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Adam. That's great. You're certainly showing that the City of Newcastle is leading by example. So thank you for that. We will hold the questions to the end. I've got a few questions now in the group chat, which is great, and there'll be time at the end, I believe, for more. But Amer Hussein has joined us and is the next speaker, so I'll introduce you now, Amer. Amer is the head of Liddell Transition at HEI Energy, and was appointed to that role in January 2020. Accountable for the preparation and delivery of Liddell Power Station closure and the transition program, the first coal-fired power station closure in the AGL generation portfolio. Amer joined AGL's Government and Corporate Affairs function in 2014, supporting developments, operations and exit of upstream gas projects, renewables and thermal generation operations, as well as establishing government and stakeholder engagement strategies to transition AGL power stations into Hunter regional economy. And so for those stakeholder engagement practitioners out there, including myself, there's hope to climb the corporate ladder as Amer has done. Welcome, Amer. Thank you for your time, and take it away, mate.
Thank you very much, Michael. Just before I kick off, can everyone see my slide on my screen?
Yeah, it's looking good, mate. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, excellent. And thank you very much for the introduction, Michael. Yes, I have started to make a bit of a shift out of politics and I guess the broader corporate affairs and public relations arena. However, I'm not entirely sure as to whether I'm doing very well. Hopefully, regardless of that, I can share with you a little bit more of the work that AGL is doing, and provide some confidence and I guess a little bit more insight into our activities. So just at a high level and very quickly for those of you who aren't entirely aware or across all of the AGL streams, we operate across 5 states in Australia. We employ just under 4,000 people, and we provide almost 3.8 million energy services to customers, plus and more recently have made a series of acquisitions in the broadband and mobile phone service space. So we have and we welcome now 170,000 additional customers to the growing AGL portfolio. From a sort of energy-centric perspective, we have roughly 20% of the total energy generation capacity within the NEM. We operate Australia's largest private electricity generation portfolio and are the largest private investor in renewable technology. However, on that point, we have still 60% of our current electricity portfolio is supported by and provided by thermal coal. So AGL's strategy is driven by 3 core objectives of growth, transformation, and social license. And in April 2015, AGL committed to not extending the life of any of our existing coal-fired power stations, including Liddell, Bayswater, and Loy Yang Power Station and Mine in the Latrobe Valley. And we announced closure dates for each of these 3 assets, starting with Liddell in 2022-23, Bayswater in 2035, and Loy Yang Power Station in the Latrobe Valley, closing by no later than 2048. Since that time, AGL has developed and started publishing plans and guidance for its approach to asset retirement and transition to low emissions technology, including, and you may have seen some recent announcement over the past week or so, but opportunities that we are starting to explore and take some investment exposures on the Liddell site itself. Looking into the future, we are focused on moving from a carbon intensive large asset portfolio with a long exposure into energy commodity markets today toward a carbon neutral portfolio that orchestrates a series of diverse, flexible, and also decentralized asset providers aimed at providing new value to our customers. We are also focused on moving from being a leader in electricity and gas retail only to becoming a leader of a series of essential services, including broadband, mobile phones, and the delivery of other relevant and critical services. And this approach to transition of our own asset fleet, but also our investment portfolio, is guided by the recently published climate statement and commitments. That's a document that we released at the back end of last financial years. And I guess as we work toward the full closure of our power stations and the Australian economy transitions toward a full decarbonisation by 2050, we are expanding our own commitments in the pursuit of the 2050 net emission zero target. And as Australia's largest integrated electricity generator and retailing company, we recognise that we have a fundamental role to play in supporting and enabling those 3 major forces of change based on customer demand, community expectations, and new technologies. The climate statement that we released at the end of June outlines 5 key commitments and 5 key areas that we as a business are focused on. And I'd like to kind of start with number 5 first, because I think it's a really important and bold move and highlights the approach that we'd like to set for us as an industry leader and hopefully as a participant in the broader Australian corporate arena. And that is being transparent. We'd like to be transparent about the progress of our efforts, and have made a decision to tie the performance of some of these metrics to our long-term investment and incentive packages for our executive. That's something that has been reported fairly widely within the media, and I think it does sort of highlight AGL's commitment in focusing on this space. And then if we kind of work around the dial a bit more, the first kind of core area is to ensure that we can start offering our customers optionality of carbon neutral products and services, supporting the evolution of new carbon markets, and continue to invest in new sources of electricity supply. But I guess most importantly, and I guess most relevant to my discussion and why I'm here today, is that we are looking to responsibly transition our energy portfolio. And two aspects of that is, one, providing long-term notice to the market and other investors that we are preparing the closure of our existing thermal fleet, and most importantly, working closely with our people and the communities where we operate, who will be impacted through this change. So as you can see on this slide here, we have a significant operating asset base with a strong development pipeline and PPA optionality, both across electricity and gas. But looking closer at our region, we have an extensive current and planned generation, either generating assets or projects within the pipeline that we are looking to pursue. So in the Hunter region, we have currently in operation the Newcastle gas storage facility, and adjacent to that site, we are in the planning stages of the development of a 250 megawatt gas-fired power station. We have a engineering and technical feasibility underway for a 250 megawatt pumped hydro project up at Bells Mountain next to Muswellbrook, and our extensive operating assets, Liddell and Bayswater, plus the Hunter Valley gas turbines at the AGL Macquarie site in Muswellbrook and Singleton LGAs. And more recently, we have lodged plans with the New South Wales Planning Department and started the feasibility on the development of up to a 500 megawatt battery earmarked at the Liddell site. So talking a little bit more closely to home, AGL Macquarie is sort of the flagship operating asset for the AGL portfolio. It represents 44% of AGL's total generating portfolio, being Liddell and Bayswater. Liddell, I think, probably one of the more famous power stations in Australia, 2,000 megawatts, currently derated to 1,680 megawatts, but has 4 black coal-fired power units nearing the end of its life, earmarked for 2022-23 retirement. And its neighbour, Bayswater Power Station, 4 units of 620 megawatts, with an efficiency upgrade underway at each of those 4 units. AGL acquired Macquarie Generation from the state of New South Wales in September 2014, and it currently provides roughly 35% of the electricity demand for New South Wales. As we start to look toward transitioning our asset portfolio, we believe that there is significant value at the AGL Macquarie site for further energy investments or other complementary reuses. The site is very complex in nature and spans multiple LGAs and totals 10,000 hectares, with access to extensive land, road, rail and other water infrastructure directly within AGL's ownership, or I guess in close proximity to the site. So we believe that this site can be leveraged to deliver ongoing economic and public benefits to the community. And I guess for those of you who are not familiar with the Upper Hunter, the AGL Macquarie site sits between Singleton and Muswellbrook, and has the New England Highway that runs pretty much through the middle of the site. And at the bottom of the site, at the tip of the site, we have the Hunter River, and on the other side of the river, there's the Golden Highway. We have a series of rail loops, and obviously the electricity infrastructure is significant. And just for context, what we have done is overlay the AGL Macquarie boundary across the Sydney metropolitan area, just to give people a bit of an appreciation of what 10,000 hectares actually looks like. So the Liddell Transition Program and the team that I'm leading is responsible for safely retiring Liddell, supporting our people and broader community, while we create new investments, or at least facilitate new investments to maximise future value of the site. And there are 6 core, I guess, work streams or areas that we are responsible for, and that make up the broader Liddell transition team. And the first is asset retirement and demolition. There's the physical infrastructure that we are currently working through, preparing the plans to physically separate any of the shared infrastructure that Bayswater will continue to rely on, and then work through a series of very deliberate and comprehensive plans to safely retire each of the 4 generating units, and work through a process to eventually demolish and rehabilitate the site. And obviously the core focus of that is to ensure that we have no impact to safety or generation. The second aspect is our people and our workforce specifically. We employ several hundred people, and we have made a commitment to no forced redundancies as a result of Liddell's closure. And so we want to ensure that through this process, we can create new pathways and options for our people to consider, either to be retrained, redeployed, or look for alternate employment. Alongside all of that is our ongoing engagement with the broader community and with our key stakeholders, all levels of government, business, industry, and broader community groups. A core aspect of making any of that happen is ensuring that we have adequate planning and approvals frameworks in place, and whether it's replacing an asset or removing an asset or investing in something entirely different, we require a focus, and we actually have a focus team delivering a planning and approvals regime to support this program. And alongside that, we have a team that is continually assessing innovative and new reuse opportunities to consider invest the infrastructure that will be made a surplus post Liddell's closure. And then obviously there's it's a heavily industrialized site. It's had already a 50-year history, and ensuring that we can make safe, stable, and rehabilitate key assets, starting with the Liddell Ash Dam, for example, and continuing our way through is also of core importance. So this is just a bit of a fast facts slide. It's a one-pager. It is my last slide, but I hope what I can kind of pull together on this slide is an illustration of the complexity, but also the variability of some of the considerations that we are currently working through. And so the transition program is separated into sort of 7 core phases, and we're very much so in the closure planning phase at the moment, and starting to develop and execute on the plans to decouple and physically separate the shared infrastructure between Liddell and Bayswater. Following that, at April 2022, the first unit will retire, and we're currently working through a program to develop to support that execution. Following that point, and for the 12 months following, Liddell will run as a 3-unit station, and at April 2023, the remaining 3 units will retire. And from that point, we will embark on a fairly extensive 6 months decommissioning program, which will hopefully get us to a point by the back end of calendar year 2023, a state where the site will be de-energized, and the station will commence demolition from early calendar year 2024. Alongside all of that, we are currently working through a series of future site opportunities, and you can see the list there, fairly extensive, fairly broad, but ranging between energy storage, which AGL has made some recent announcements in, and there's a lot of interest from AGL and other third parties to look at a range of other redevelopment scenarios, including waste to energy, energy intensive manufacturing, food, and other sustainable bioenergy practices, as well as looking to leverage the existing infrastructure that is currently around the site. Alongside all of that, as I spoke about previously, we have a fairly well developed program that is currently being formed to support our people through this workforce, through the workforce transition over the next few years. And one of the core sort of centerpieces of that is the development of what we're calling the Future U Hub, which will essentially be a one-stop shop sort of center made available to our people, embedded contractors, as well as our workforce's families, to access a series of outplacement, career counselling, training, and other support services. We hope that that will assist our people with defining what is important to them and where they would like to end up through this significant change. Alongside all of that, we have a series of well-established working groups with our employees, the broader community, council working groups, as well as our unions and other employee representatives. So on that note, I will, I guess I'll hand back to Michael, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Amer. Now, Amer does have to leave the webinar earlier than we will finish, so we have got a few minutes set aside at this point to take any questions, or take a few questions at least. So if you'd like to ask a question, just put it into the Zoom group chat, and the chat function is in the middle at the bottom of your screen if you mouse over there. I'll start the ball rolling, Amer. I'm not sure if you're this is an area of intense expertise, but I want to talk about that the purchase of Southern Phone, and I'm wondering if there are some synergies in there with the use of smart meters and so on for rooftop solar. I know AGL has some great deals going with a share in people's personal batteries, and a deal for charging your EV from home and that sort of thing for good rates and so on. Is Southern Phone infrastructure going to assist in that regard, or is this a separate entity altogether?
So that's probably a question that I can partially answer at the moment, and happy to take anything else on notice. The acquisition that we made with Southern Phones last financial year was I guess a bit of a test case to better understand how we may be able to integrate over the longer term and orchestrate a series of critical services to our customers, both behind the meter and leveraging the existing knowledge and know-how that we have, particularly in the energy space, but also with our larger C&I customers as well. So I think that's probably a partial answer, but I think it's safe to say we're still very much so in the learning space. What we would like to do as well over the next little while is to integrate some of those services into the broader AGL sort of branding and offering, but at this stage I'm not aware of what those timeframes are.
Okay, thanks for that. I've had a couple of other questions come through. So Adam Clarke, our previous speaker from the City of Newcastle, has asked, do you see any likelihood of the battery storage implementation being brought forward at Liddell?
So the scoping report that we lodged last week with the New South Wales Department of Planning states that we would like the first phase of the battery to be up in service by well, between January and well, I guess the first half of calendar year 2022. There is still a fairly extensive piece of work to procure and go through a fairly significant planning and approvals process, as well as to construct that battery. And obviously, with as you'd be able to appreciate, the complexity of an existing and operating site, it does create some challenges. But I think the significant opportunity there is to remove the first unit and then I guess plug in the new battery into the existing switchyard, and that's the key driver that we have there.
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, when you're ready for the batteries to be installed, I believe Elon Musk can do it in 100 days or it's free. So I have that on good authority. I can give you his Twitter handle if you like.
That'd be good, thanks.
So look, we have one from Chris Peters. I think you probably answered this to an extent, but he's saying, why is there no mention of replacing the coal-fired generation with renewable energy such as solar or wind firmed with batteries?
So that's a really good question. And I think as our CEO to be in the constructor and operator plex. Where we've landed now is certainly over the last sort of decade or so, the technology and also the investment potential has matured substantially, and we don't believe we have a key role to continue playing in that space. And as such, I think there's a secondary opportunity that's opened up there, which is twofold. The first is we can offer these developers and operators of wind and solar plants a PPA over a long period of time, because we have a strong retail book. And the second aspect is we can see a space for us to directly play in the developer, constructor and operator of large-scale batteries and also pumped hydro. And so we think that there's a pretty strong handle on renewable technology and renewable operators. We can complement that with our wholesale market and retail books, and play in a bit more of the firm and dispatchable energy space.
Thanks for that. Look, one last question and we'll let you go. Catherine said, I'm concerned to hear about continued dependence on gas and other fossil fuel. When do you expect this to be phased out?
So this is a really good question, and I think it'd be great to take this one on notice, because I guess I don't have a really firm view and a handle on the future of gas in our portfolio. I do suspect, though, that it is considered a bit of a bridging fuel, particularly when we use that as another form of dispatchable technology through our gas-fire power station projects. And depending on sort of what we use that fuel for, specifically sort of referring to our larger customers down in Victoria, there is a large sort of gas demand from our C&I customers there, and so we do see that as an ongoing requirement for the foreseeable future. But unfortunately, Catherine, sorry, I can't give you a firm date on when we think that can be phased out, but happy to take that one on notice.
All right, thanks, Amer. There was another question, but we'll have to move on. I'm sorry, but thank you, Amer, for your time today. If you're happy to hang around to the end, I'm sure there'll be more questions, but I believe you have another appointment. So I'll thank you on behalf of HEI. And we'll now move on to our next speaker. This is Dr. Jenny Hayward, who is a Senior Research Scientist at CSIRO Energy. And Jenny leads research projects on the technology cost projections and the model she's developed are used to project the cost of electricity generation technologies for AEMO and the Australian Government. Jenny has made economic modelling contributions to Roadmap, the renewable energy projects, including the National Hydrogen Roadmap and the Low Emissions Technology Roadmap. She has contributed to studies undertaken by CSIRO on energy storage, carbon capture and storage, remote area power systems, the techno-economic potential of solar fuels, it sounds like a PhD title, and concentrating to solar thermal, and sustainable aviation fuels and ocean renewable energy. Dr. Hayward's focus is on developing new methods and modelling approaches to provide robust projections of the capital costs of existing and emerging electricity generation and fuel conversion technologies. And Jenny's going to talk today about opportunities for hydrogen in commercial aviation. I'm really looking forward to this. Should be quite interesting. Thank you, Jenny. You can share your screen and take yourself off mute and go for it. Thank you.
I will do. Thank you for the intro. Okay. All right, so yeah, so I'm going to talk about a project that we did for Boeing. We sort of finished early this year before COVID hit. So opportunities for hydrogen in commercial aviation. So I'll just start with some commercial aviation trends. So there is an ongoing challenge. Sorry, slides blocked. So ongoing challenge. So there's increasingly stringent environmental regulations, and they've also got emission reduction commitments, but at the same time expected growth in passenger demand. So the IATA, which is the Aviation Industry Association, they've got a target of 50% reduction on 2005 emission levels by 2050, with no increase in net emissions after 2020. So it's a very stringent target, and it has been endorsed by Boeing and the broader aviation sector. So to date, the sector has achieved over 2% annual and fuel efficiency improvements, and that's expected to continue. However, despite those efficiency improvements, when you combine that with the amount of passenger growth expected, there's going to be a threefold increase in CO2 emissions by 2050. So you can see in that figure that I've got on the right, so we've got actually what was projected for 2020 at the start of the year. So I suspect by the end of the year, that's going to be a bit less. You can see what the growth is expected to be in 2050, and then where the target sits, which is a 90% reduction. So it's a massive task. I should say too, while we're on this with COVID, so they're expecting, so while it has had an impact and it's reduced demand for aviation by at least 40% across the world, they are, and that's sort of that trend, they expect that trend to continue in the short term. So say you know, maybe the next 5 years, but they're still expecting there to be that long-term trend in 2050, as shown here. So there's only so far you can go with improving efficiency. And the next step is a greater focus on sustainable aviation fuels. So in the past, we've spent a bit of time looking at biofuels, as had the industry, but there's limited uptake of that. So that, you know, there's been limited uptake so far. There's only you know, so much availability of biomass for biofuels. So they've actually started to look at hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels now. So reason for that is that there has been, in the last few years, a notable acceleration in the development of the hydrogen industry. And it's been driven by a confluence of factors. So the maturity, the technologies have matured. So the hydrogen production, storage, transport technologies have matured. There's been a massive reduction in the cost of renewable energy. So if you're using electrolysis, so in that breakout there, I've got clean hydrogen. So if you're making hydrogen from electrolysis, you need electricity and water, they're the feedstocks. So you can actually use zero or low emission electricity to make that hydrogen. There's been a growing acceptance of its potential, so hydrogen's potential, as one of the only ways to achieve deeper decarbonisation, both in and outside of the electricity sector, and in particular in the transport sector. So there's been more focus on other forms of transport to date, you know, mainly road vehicles. We wanted to look at the role hydrogen can play in helping decarbonise the aviation sector. So these are some of the opportunities in aviation. So that figure is showing what could be done in 2025, in 2035, and then by 2050. So we've broken the different application areas down into the 3 primary technology categories with that time component, which reflects the expected development periods required. So by 2025, that's sort of the low-hanging fruit. We're seeing mainly on the ground support. So you can have zero emission electricity, ancillary fuel cell airport services, some on-site electrolyzers, hydrogen storage and a refueling station, and backup power generators using fuel cells. What that could be doing is driving the ground support equipment, or GSE as they call it. So that's one of the early opportunities. Then by 2035, actually using blended, what they call electrofuels. So electrofuels are where you make a synthetic fuel using hydrogen made from electrolysis, so using electricity and water, combining that with a source of CO2, which could be from direct air capture or from an industrial process to make a synthetic fuel. So we're only talking about blending with fossil jet fuel by 2035. Then by 2050, looking at large-scale hydrogen production, making electrofuels, so all electrofuels, and also having a fuel cell auxiliary power unit on aircraft itself. So this is the potential CO2 abatement curve. So that line, so the straight line going up is where are the business as usual aircraft emissions that we're expecting by 2050. And then what we've shown is how you can actually reduce those emissions from the different parts of aviation. So ground support equipment, or GSC, converting that from what they currently use now, which is a lot of diesel or gas, to hydrogen. Doesn't do much, does a little bit. So it's, let's see if I can get the pointer to get there. So a little sort of slither. Then on-ground aircraft activity. So that's where the aircraft is actually sitting on the ground, and you can plug in power to the aircraft. So it's not actually sitting there burning jet fuel. Again, that does a little bit. And then we look at the main bulk of it, which is blending with electro fuels, and then to 100% electro fuels. So the focus of our report was on hydrogen, and we're not discounting the importance of other sustainable aviation fuels. And jet aircraft powered by pure hydrogen isn't included in the abatement curve, just because that technology is so much further away, because it means redesigning the aircraft. Okay, I'll keep going. So this is our adjacent and on the airport applications, as I was saying about the ground support equipment. So shown in that table on the right are the material, or sort of the main users of fuel for the ground support equipment. So we managed to get some data for Dallas-Fort Worth Airport in the US, and it's actually the 15th biggest airport in the world. So it was good to actually have access to that data, and we were able to look at replacing diesel consumption with hydrogen-powered ground support equipment. The trouble with trying to roll it out is that you need to get an adequate scale of hydrogen production to bring the cost of the hydrogen production down while still balancing supply and demand. And there's a wide variety of equipment that needs upgrading. So as you can see, this is only part of it, but an airport has, I think, more than 40 different types of ground support equipment. So this is just some of the infrastructure that you'd need to produce hydrogen on site. So, well, first of all, it would be imported to run the GSC in the first place. So you'd probably truck it in, but then you'd start putting electrolyzers on site and making hydrogen. So as you can see in that figure, we've got a variety of electricity sources going into the electrolyzers to make hydrogen. Going. So you can get a high degree of scale with a lower risk profile by prioritising off-the-shelf technologies that already use hydrogen. So again, for that ground support equipment, a lot of it includes forklifts. They use cars on the tarmac for just ferrying people around, buses and stationary power. So again, going back to that Dallas-Fort Worth example, you'd need a 4 megawatt electrolyzer just to power all of that. And we also looked at, so if you're going to do that, you could also you could make more hydrogen and then power the adjacent transport industries such as fleets, buses, freight and possibly trains that all run to and from the airport. And you could even include public refueling stations. So this is just going into a bit of the economics behind it. So we calculated the levelized cost of transport for the different types of ground support equipment, and the units for that are in dollars per hour. We found some capital costs of these different ground support equipments, and then in order to convert them to hydrogen, we also included a 25% penalty on the cost. But even then, what's highlighted in the bold is where hydrogen is cheaper than what they're currently using, which is diesel. So there's quite significant opportunities there, and it tends to be in the ones, the GSC, that actually use a lot of fuel. However, the capital cost associated with the asset turnover in this equipment does present a more immediate barrier to the development. So, I mean, maybe they could implement some policy mechanisms to absorb some of the capital cost and underwrite that initial investment. And I've just got a lot of slides, I'll keep going. So, given the technology maturity and commercial competitiveness of fuel cell ground support equipment, implementation of these investment priorities could see the rate of uptake accelerate after 2025, replacing all of the ground support equipment in or around 2035. However, like I showed you before, it doesn't actually have a massive impact on the total sector emissions, but it is a place to start. And it would then flow, you know, that hydrogen production would flow into other sectors that are around the airport. So now onto the electrofuels. So because of the low rate of asset turnover within the aviation sector, one of the easier and most economical ways to actually introduce hydrogen and reduce emissions in that sector is to start introducing electrofuels, because you don't need extensive changes in the aircraft or the infrastructure. So so the way to make the electrofuels is to take your zero emission electricity, water, a source of CO2, which could be from direct air capture, an industrial flue gas, or from power stations. We looked at two types of electrolyzers. So the solid oxide electrolyzer relies on a source of heat, but it is more efficient. And we also looked at the sort of lower, the more commercial proton exchange membrane and alkaline electrolyzers, which have been available for several years. So combine the hydrogen and the CO2 into the synthesis plant, which might be a Fischer-Tropsch process or a methanol then to jet fuel. And the nice thing about those processes is they actually produce heat. And so you could actually combine that with the solid oxide electrolyzer. So you're not actually having to heat up the electrolyzer and use more fuel. So anyway, bring all that together, you get your electrofuels. So this is just a comparison of the levelized cost of the two different types of electrofuels. So we've got one made from the Fischer-Tropsch process on the left, and the other one via a methanol route on the right. You can see the cost per barrel, and then the expected cost of conventional jet fuel in 2040, 2050. So, I mean, they do cost more, but then they are zero emission. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, sorry, I'll keep going because I'm running out of time. So if there is strategic global investment, it is possible for large-scale electrofuel production to be de-risked after 2030, allowing for an accelerated uptake thereafter, which we're going to need to actually get to that target by 2050. And given the infrastructure required, all sustainable aviation fuels, so including biofuels, are likely to play a role, because what we're asking for is a massive scale up. So despite the CO2 emissions abatement achieved through the uptake of synthetic fuel blends, rollout of increasingly stringent environmental regulations could see a potential move away from conventional jet fuel closer to 2050. So this is where we start to look at hydrogen playing a key role in facilitating this transition, so actually being the main fuel. So there's been some work on that in the past, as you can see in the figure below, where they've looked at combining liquid hydrogen, kerosene, or ammonia. So ammonia is a carrier of hydrogen. And they've also more recently, this Boeing Phantom Eye, where, so in 2012, they used liquid hydrogen itself. Before we get to that though, we could look at using hydrogen for the non-propulsion applications. So these are a bit more technically feasible. So that includes auxiliary power units. So these are so this would power the onboard electrical equipment while the aircraft is on the ground. It's used to start engines and is used as a backup electricity source. Also in taxiing, So you could use electric taxing systems powered by fuel cells, and just a move away from hydraulics and pneumatics towards more electric architecture. So using hydrogen for auxiliary power on the ground and taxiing is a more near-term opportunity. But there is the challenge of the weight penalty because the hydrogen tanks are quite heavy. Could use cryogenic hydrogen, but then the cost goes up and it would require material changes to the aeroplane design. It would reduce ground emissions, but also increase round-trip fuel use and emissions, so not that good. Also, you've got the slow rate of asset turnover in aircraft, which sort of makes it even more difficult. So probably what's more likely is development of hydrogen fuel cell ground power units and electric taxiing systems that are external to the aircraft. However, in order to do that, there needs to be extensive work in overcoming the safety and operational challenges associated with increased levels of capital equipment on or near runways. Oh, sorry, I'll skip these. Okay, so this is just getting onto different aircraft designs. So cryogenic hydrogen, so I'll just jump back. So we have done analysis of different types of fuels. And hydrogen is great in terms, so liquid hydrogen is great in terms of energy density by mass, but not by volume. So basically, if you're going to use it, you need to actually change the aircraft design. So, moving away from conventional airframes to models such as a blended wing body, as shown in that figure. So it's got promise in improved aerodynamic efficiency, and you can also accommodate larger volumes of fuel. However, that's sort of way out, you know, not until close to 2050, maybe even further. I'll stop there. I'm close to 20 minutes, so thank you. Well,
thank you very much. Yeah, obviously, you know, we were flying a lot later than we were moving along on the ground. So there's a fair way to go in the research and development in that space, but there's certainly a need there. We will not go to questions right now, but what I'll do is move straight on to Sam. But thank you for the presentation on hydrogen. So Sam Mella is the Hunter Engagement Lead at Beyond Zero Emissions, or BZE. She's going to be talking about the Million Jobs Plan, what's possible and how do we get there. Sam has a Bachelor of Communications and Culture with high honours. Sam is a writer, consultant, connector and communicator, and the founder and director of Pilbara Solar, which will be an interesting chat over a beer sometime, Sam, I'm sure. Pilbara Solar is a renewable energy company based in Western Australia. Today, Sam is going to talk about the Beyond Zero Emissions Million Jobs Plan. And without further ado, take it away, Sam. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can you hear you fine? And if you'd like to share your screen, we'll go for it.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to say thank you to the Hunter Environment Institute for this opportunity. It's been a really fascinating afternoon and so many great speakers, so thank you very much. I'm going to talk today about the Million Jobs Plan, which you may have seen in the news. It's BZE's latest and greatest project, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Hunter Diversification Project. So around the world, economists have highlighted the merits of putting low carbon initiatives at the heart of our economic recovery from the COVID recession. And BZE's Million Jobs Plan sort of looks at what that would look like for Australia. And also the Hunter was a case study for the Million Jobs Plan. It's chapter 9. So please download it and have a read. I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm speaking to you from Warramai country here on the Williams River. And I'd also like to acknowledge the volunteers. BZE is a climate change solutions think tank. largely there is a small staff, but most of our research is done by volunteers who are professionals, retired people. We have all kinds of volunteers contributing: engineers, scientists, writers, editors, graphic designers. So that's what makes our research possible. So, and thank you to our volunteers. So how we're working with the Million Jobs Plan and also with the Hunter Diversification Project is like looking at the national vision, like looking at what things could be like if we rolled out 90 gigawatts of renewable energy in the next 5 years, and looking at the jobs that we could create from that and the industries that we could build on that. But Beyond Zero Emissions also has the Zero Carbon Community program, where we work very closely on the ground with communities, with people, with projects. And we also have the Investment Reference Group that sits above the Zero Carbon Community program, which has everything from mum and dad investors to the big super funds who are there ready to invest in zero carbon projects, really. So our research is backed by reality on the ground. The Hunter Diversification Project, Beyond Zero has done some place-based research in Port Augusta, in the Northern Territory, and in Collie in Western Australia, and now we're into the Hunter Diversification Project. It's a 2-year project. We're about 6 months into it. And we're looking at everything that is going on in the Hunter at the moment. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of different projects, there's a lot of discussion about the future of the Hunter. And our volunteers have been put this project together, and Beyond Zero Emissions has funded it. So we're really looking at connecting with everyone across the Hunter and engaging with people and what the people of the Hunters, how you see your future. So in this changing world, so we'd love to hear from you if we haven't spoken to you already. Okay, so back to the Million Jobs Plan. This is the advisory panel that we had, that we sort of reviewed and guided our work over for the Million Jobs project, and we're also putting together our advisory panel for the Hunter project at the moment. So we had some pretty serious players on this who critiqued our work. So we're fairly confident in our work. And this is the Million Jobs team, which was absolutely massive. People from all over Australia. So what did we find? So what we found was over a 5-year period, we could create well over 1 million jobs. However, we counted jobs as job years, so 1 job for 1 year. Yeah, and these jobs will be in a range of sectors like renewable energy, recycling, transport, buildings, and land use. Some of them are short-term jobs, and some of them are ongoing, and will last beyond the 5 years. So the Million Jobs Plan is underpinned by renewable energy, and Australia is really very blessed with lots of renewable energy resources, and the Australian economy and the Hunter economy could really be future-proofed by a massive investment in renewable energy. So Hunter, as I mentioned, a fast track of 90 gigawatts of renewable energy over the next 5 years. There's 160 gigawatts of projects already in the pipeline. But one thing that everyone agreed when we were doing the research, that we really need to fast track some transmission infrastructure to support the 90 gigawatt rollout. Okay, so that's something that, in some cases government can help us with, but there's also opportunities for private investors. And I just want to highlight this project in Queensland, the Copper String project. So it's a 1,000 kilometre line that links Townsville with Mount Isa in far western Queensland. So it opens up huge wind and solar resources along the route, and it will connect Mount Isa to the national electricity market. And for Mount Isa's copper mine and smelter, it could cut the cost of electricity in half. So $1.5 billion worth of private finance going into this project, and quite a few jobs as well. Not a lot of ongoing jobs, but still lots of construction jobs in the transmission line itself. So as we ramp up our installation of renewable energy in Australia, we need to really think about making equipment here in Australia. And the example in the Million Jobs report is of Geelong, an oil factory in Newcastle that is now making wind turbines. But we think that Newcastle is a really great place to make wind turbines. And we've got a lot of the infrastructure and skills here already to do that. And imagine if, you know, the REZ, the renewable energy zones on the New England tableland and you know, other offshore wind projects around Australia used wind turbines made in Newcastle. It's a great opportunity for our local industry and manufacturing here. So, so another area we looked at in the Million Jobs Plan is buildings. And you know, in normal times, construction employs over 1 million people in Australia. But you know, there's a lot of fear around the industry at the moment. People could lose their jobs. So our building initiative is a way to reverse this. Firstly, there's a focus on building energy efficient social housing that will create 430,000 jobs over 5 years. But also there's an opportunity with retrofits, but I'll talk more about retrofits later because we profiled that in the Hunter case study. And there's new ways of delivering the retrofits, because not everyone has the money up front to completely retrofit their home to make it really energy efficient. But I just want to highlight this business model that's in Europe at the moment. So this company Energy Strong, you don't have to have any upfront money, but they take responsibility for your retrofit, and then you don't have an energy bill, but you pay an energy service fee. So it's a little bit like a PPA, and you know what your energy costs are going to be. So we think if this can work in Northern Europe, where there's not that much sunshine, it's a great opportunity to do it here. Okay, so manufacturing. The Million Jobs Plan, Beyond Zero has another report called Electrifying Industry, which talks all about electric manufacturing. But the industries by electrifying industry, there's a real opportunity to decarbonise supply chains, and that is something that a lot of businesses and even countries are looking at, is to getting rid of the scope 2 and 3 emissions in supply chains of products they purchase, especially in metals. And this is just another opportunity that arises from an electrified industry. And Molly Copper Newcastle has been a market leader in this area, and they said, you know, that it's about what the customer wants. You know, if you've only got one customer or a couple of customers and they want to decarbonise their supply chain, and you know, you just have to change. So so there's a lot of manufacturing opportunity in an electrified industry. So as aluminium. So as I've been doing the engagement in the Hunter, I have to say that probably in 90% of the engagement, people bring up Tomago aluminium. Everyone's really concerned, especially with the Tiwai smelter closing this month in New Zealand, and a lot of people say, you know, how, you know, we need Tomago to stay in Newcastle. You know, what can we do that so Tomago stays competitive and remains in Newcastle? So, you know, renewable energy. Alcoa anticipates 80% of their global smelting portfolio will be powered by renewable energy. So the long-term future for Australia's smelters is, and to save jobs, is to switch to renewable energy. So there can be a bonus into doing this. Smelters can support the reliability of a grid dominated by renewables, and there's actually a smelter in Germany that actually makes more money for its grid services now than it does from making aluminium. Yeah. So transport, again, I'll talk about this a little bit more in the Hunter section because we did a case study on electric buses. But this is the future. Shenzhen in China switched its entire fleet of 16,000 buses to electric in 3 years. So, and there's a company in Australia called Zenobi that retrofits midlife buses to become electric. Lots of opportunity in electrification of transport vehicles. Land restoration. So this is a really important sector. And again, I'll talk about it in the Hunter section, but this is the only sector where we can both reduce emissions and draw down our emissions. So we can create lots of jobs by reforesting and restoring the land. We can help the land hold more carbon and water. We can, change the climate, create microclimate, and we can employ people by restoring the land. And our Hunter diversification project is definitely addressing land use. So love to hear from you all or people that you know about ideas for land use in the Hunter in the future. Okay, I talked about zero carbon communities earlier, but Beyond Zero, we have engaged with 65 communities over Australia, and what we know is they really like low carbon future. They see this low carbon or zero carbon communities as the future, and they want, they love the Million Jobs Plan. So our zero carbon communities have identified 38,000 jobs in individual consultations across Australia with different community-based projects. So just coming on to the Hunter, what does the Million Jobs Plan mean for the Hunter? I feel like we only really scratched the surface. We did 5 case studies, and 115,000 job years over 10 years with 24,000 ongoing jobs. And we looked at 5 sectors. We looked at the housing retrofits, 250,000 houses in the Hunter. To bring them up to a 6-star energy rating would create 10,000 jobs a year for over 5 years, and just make everyone's home a lot more comfortable, which is really great when you get 3 days of 40 degrees. We looked at land use. We held a workshop with people who live on the land, and talk through some, and we want to hold more ongoing discussions with people living on the land. But mine rehabilitation obviously came up as a massive opportunity to employ people and sort of restore the land. Also a great opportunity for renewable energy projects. There's, farming is diversifying. You can get carbon credits now. You can get farmers and forestry credits and biodiversity credits. So these opportunities for farmers to restore their land. And also we would really love to see some Indigenous land and water ranges in the Hunter. And, as we all saw during the bushfire season, that Indigenous knowledge is really relevant to Australia, and Indigenous people know a lot about managing the land. So just bringing some of that back, and employing people for sharing their knowledge. Amer mentioned that there is some cleanup to be done after coal-fired power. So we talked to a company called Vercor, who who through from the feasibility stage, building the factory to, you know, getting the factory operational so they could employ 400 people, sort of to commercialise the fly ash resource with coarse aggregates and tiles. They process it so it locks up the heavy metals and contaminants, and then it can be commercialised. So back into the electrified manufacturing, there's the steel opportunity. I think everyone in Newcastle would love to, well, see the steel industry come back, and the Grattan Institute has just done a report, and we used their case studies of having two hydrogen-based steel factories in the Hunter would create 10,000 jobs. And then there's you know, emerging technologies like molten oxide electrolysis, which uses electrolysis. It's early stages, but you know, this is the next generation of steel making. And zero emissions buses. So the Transport for New South Wales needs 8,000 zero emission buses by 2050, and we think the Hunter is the best place in New South Wales for those buses to be made. We spoke to some businesses, including businesses that traditionally support the mines, and they have the skills and the workforce to pivot to zero emissions production. So, you know, New South Wales in their zero emission procurement really can back the Hunter on this one, and I know the Transport for New South Wales trials closed at the beginning of the expression of interest closed at the beginning of August. So hopefully we'll see, the Hunter was one of the pilot regions, so hopefully we'll see some zero emission pilots coming out on our roads up here in the Hunter soon. Okay, so these case studies were just the beginning of the Hunter Diversification Project. You would have seen in the Newcastle Herald this weekend, the Committee for the Hunter had 3 fantastic projects that they were talking about to bring, you know, commercialisation of, the container port, the STEM centre in Newcastle, and upgrading the airport to. So there's lots of opportunities to diversify and create a fantastic future for the Hunter. And thank you very much. I look forward to hearing from you. Please come and join us.
Thank you, Sam. That's great. Great presentation. And they are all great presentations. And thanks for holding on there, Sam, because you know, obviously all the other presenters were just a warm-up act for you. You've done a great job. Thank you. Now, we did get a couple of questions as you were speaking, and Rick asked about the retrofits you were talking about towards the beginning of your presentation. And so maybe you can answer this one, Sam. How does the tenant pay for the retrofit?
Yeah, good question. That in the Energy Sprong model, like you would need to have an agreement with the landlord, but it's more like a long-term power purchase agreement. But I need to connect you to one of our volunteers who's done an enormous amount of work on this and has looked at some modelling for homeowners, for businesses, and for tenants. So if I can get your contact details, I'll connect you.
All right, thanks for that. So look, there are opportunities now to ask questions of Sam or of any of our presenters that are still with us. I think that Amer's had to leave, and I think the others are still here. Adam Clarke has put in some links onto the chat to the Million Jobs Plan and the Diversifying the Hunter document, and also the Newcastle Climate Action Plan, which is very appropriate. Thanks, Adam. And then, okay, one question here. What is renewable mining? What was that the term?
Yes, that's mining powered by renewable energy, and we're not seeing so much of it in the Hunter yet, but maybe we could get some projects going. But I think it's South 38 in Western Australia is a new mine that's using a really high penetration of renewables, and they're also processing minerals on site, and it is it is actually a way the mining industry is going.
Thanks, Sam. We are looking for more questions from the viewers. So if you've got, if you'd like to plug into the chat there and just type away a question, that'd be great. Sam, I will mention I heard of a project a couple of years ago where some of the mining trucks were actually picking up energy on the way down the hill. So they would drive up the hill with their electric truck and pick up a load of, let's say, rock or ore or whatever it was. On the way down the hill, they would use their brakes and pick up energy into the battery. And when they got down the bottom, they'd offload their load and then put the energy into the grid and then go back up the hill again. So that's pretty exciting.
Where was that?
I can't recall, but I can try and look it up for you. Okay, so Catherine said, I'd love to see a link between Sam and Amer. Thanks for that. We'll take that as a comment. Okay, any other questions from our viewers? So Adam's standing by, I can see. We've got Sam as well. No other questions on the chat right now. Adam, I'll ask you a question about the vehicle fleet. How many cars have we got in Newcastle City Council, City of Newcastle, sorry, that are electric vehicles at this point?
Not enough, but yeah, so we've started converting over the cars. We've got about 5 EVs. We're looking at a truck through C Electric, which is a Victorian company that's doing great stuff in the bigger truck sort of category. And as I mentioned, doing a study on the waste fleet. So all up, we've got about 220 vehicles across all those categories. And yeah, the action plan looks at how we transition those to electric.
Thank you. Yeah, I've seen that one of the side benefits, I guess, of electrifying your fleet, and Canberra ACT government is doing this, of changing to an electric fleet, and the side benefit is that as they roll over that fleet over time, it puts more EVs into the market at a reduced price, the second-hand market, and that allows people to get in there at the price, a lower price point, because, you know, at the moment the price point is fairly high because we're early in this adoption phase. So yeah, that's great. We'd like to see those 5 cars roll over and turn over. I guess there are other things like policies that could assist with you know, leasing and the tax advantage you get from the can't think of the tax now. It's not capital gains, but that you could get from your through your employer as well would be useful. Rick's made a comment that our bus construction industry has died due to full imports, and why will this not be continued? I don't know if anyone wants to have a go at that one.
In the net zero emissions policy, the New South Wales government is saying that they are going to use procurement to support New South Wales businesses to move to the zero emissions economy. So let's watch this space. I know that local industry has experienced a lot of disappointment in this area, but hopefully things are turning around.
We'll use the pump was actually generating more energy than it used because it was going up light, coming down heavy, and generating electricity, and that was going to the grid. Anyway, all right, so I think that might be the end, unless anyone's got another question. We're just over time, but only by a couple of minutes, which I think is fairly amazing considering that we had 5 speakers. So look, thank you to everyone who took part today, especially our speakers. This has been recorded, so if you've got other folks that haven't had the time to cut into their day, they can get a hold of this on our website in a day or so. So thank you for that, and thanks, Nigel, for clapping. Yeah, and look, we'll see you next time. I did want to just mention that we are looking for committee members. I have a tiny little slide here that I want to share with you, which is this one. And hopefully you can see that we are recruiting. So a little bit of information there. We've been around for 32 years. We're looking for expression of interest for new committee members. And please make contact with us. So you don't have to be in the environmental field, but that's the general gist of it. But these days, environment covers so many different things. So that's it from us. Thank you very much, and yeah, looking forward to seeing you at the next one. Stay tuned and keep in touch, and we'll bring you the next one shortly. Thanks very much.